but Edmonton is distinctive that way. And I always used to be kind of proud of the fact that it was the furthest north major city in the Western Hemisphere. So when the Arctic meets the civilization, it starts in a big way with Edmonton.
The kind of newspaper, the Edmonton Journal, that you started to work at, did it come out of that that history of the city? I mean, was there something kind of unique about newspapers in Edmonton?
Well, first of all, of course, it was in the 1970s and 80s when newspapers were very wealthy. We made a lot of money. We had enormous resources. We had a lot of space. We had a lot of staff. We had a lot of choices. So newspapers were vibrant and had not a monopoly, but a very dominant position in public discourse at that time, less today. The other thing about Edmonton was that being the capital of Alberta at a very decisive change in history between Alberta and Ottawa, the Edmonton Journal became, to a degree, as coming in the capital of Alberta, as the voice of the West, unquote. And we took a lot of time and put a lot of resources into understanding Alberta's position in Confederation at a time when we had the National Energy Program, we had the repatriation of the Constitution, we had many situations arising at a dramatic forefront between Alberta and Toronto and Ottawa in particular, and Quebec. And the Edmonton Journal was really a leading voice among all of the Western papers at a very decisive chapter in the evolution of the Federation, I think.
The kind of multi-community or background side of Edmonton, did that have an impact on journalism? Was the paper a sort of a coming together of a lot of different points of view?
It certainly was of population. I mean, if you look at the names of our reporters and editors at the Edmonton Journal in the 70s and 80s, it was very much reflective of full diversity of Edmonton, multicultural city. And I'm not sure that it consciously affected our view of society and such, although we were very much caught up in the movement about multiculturalism on the prairies, which came up through the patriation of the Constitution. In fact, it was Lawrence Decore who, in the discussions around patriation of the Constitution, 1980-81, was the one who led the national cause for including multiculturalism in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms as one of the characteristics, defining characteristics of Canada. Lawrence Decore was of Ukrainian heritage, and he led that charge. As law, he led the charge on protection of natural resource rights and the amending formula and the notwithstanding clause. So Alberta played a big role there, and I think a lot of it just grew out of who we were, the values that we were trying to, and interests that we were trying to protect.
The going back to the Pulitzer Prize in 1938, or the Pulitzer Award, there's it seems to me that Balmer, as the editor, Balmer Watt as editor of the Journal at that time, I mean, that's one of the things he was fighting for, was a paper reflecting a diversity of opinion, as opposed to the kind of Eberhard social credit view of a single point of view. I mean, does Balmer's take on that feel like it belongs to Edmonton?
It belongs to Edmonton, but it belongs to the whole idea of a free press in the Western culture, I think. And, you know, Balmer Watt was on the front lines because that was the most aggressive attack on traditional freedoms of the press, which include two major areas. One is the freedom of opinion, The other one is the accuracy and completeness of news reporting. And Aberhart came at them at every level, including news coverage, trying to get sort of prior approval of government for covering the legislature kind of things, and then trying to suppress diversity of opinion. So free opinion and freedom to report news objectively from the point of view of the newspaper were both on the table in Alberta, of all places, because those things, of course, were under attack in Germany at the time, in fascist states, but we were in North America. So it was up to the Edmonton Journal and Balmer Watt to absolutely make it clear that although Aberhart, it came out of some tendencies at that time in Alberta that were common around the world, fascistic tendencies in the United States and elsewhere, that this wasn't going to stand. And it was a rather easy fight to identify, because that kind of frontal attack is going to get your attention, but a difficult one to wage well against a government that had a lot of public support behind it in a time of some, fear and paranoia in the world. So it fell to Edmonton and the Journal in the history of this country, and more broadly, to say, in North America at least, the line, no, that line cannot be crossed. And he was successful and appropriately recognized by the United States, by the Americans, by the Pulitzer people, who don't usually look outside the borders. But it's a testament to the significance of that battle for the wider world that Pulitzer reached across the border and made a special prize to Edmonton for that effort.
The rise of fascism at that time, you mentioned fear and paranoia. Why was fascism on the rise around the world in the 1930s?
It was really, I think, an outcome mostly of the First World War, although the seeds of fascism had been well planted in Italy, for example, before the First World War. But the First World War really was the beginning of a 30 years war that went right into the Cold War, that unleashed and undid the establishment. The major empires of Europe fell, with the exception of England. Whole new countries were born and others torn apart. The economic situation in Europe after the war was dire, and then was exacerbated by the Versailles Treaty, which was causing all sorts of added economic problems in Germany, then the Great Depression. And so the coming out of the war, starting in Italy in the 20s and then going into Germany, there was a great feeling of dislocation, of insecurity, and of deep anger in many quarters about the outcome of a war whose end kind of came with a whimper. It wasn't invading and total victory. It just sort of whimpered out. That was Hitler's big stab in the back thing that said, we didn't lose the war, somebody stopped it on our side. So the paranoia, the economic problems, the tremendous dislocation of the civilized Western world at that time, leading to the Second World War, was just an interregnum, a sign of a civilization that was, in a sense, in a rather suicidal mode, I would say.
I'm just going to stop us for a second, William. One of the things I forgot to mention, do you have a cell phone?
Yes.
Is it an iPhone?
Okay.
Yes.
Could you go to the voice memo app and just turn that on and just leave it in front of you?
Voicemail.
Voice memos. Mine, it's in productivity.
I've got it.
So just leave it in front of you, just hit record, and then at the end of this, email it back to us, because our editor has suggested that the audio quality of that is quite good. And sorry to interrupt, though. We're still rolling on this end, so when you're ready, Tom, we'll just continue.
That's there.
Okay.
Super. William, let's come back to fascism. Why did it arrive in Alberta? I mean, it seems to me we were a long way from Berlin.
Well, Alberta, born as a province in 1905, was born with a chip on its shoulder, as I think you were saying, you're recognizing in your own book about Alberta and the history of the journal and such. A chip on its shoulder because it was born without resource ownership of its own natural resources, unlike Ontario and Quebec, for example. And it had just a sense that the powers that be in Ottawa, including the financial powers and the political powers, were just stacked against Alberta. It must have been a certain culture in Alberta. It was stronger than that of Saskatchewan that way. But then when we got into the 1920s and there was the great battle fought to get natural resource ownership back or to Alberta from Ottawa, I think it came in 1930-31 with bonfires along the railroad tracks as the premier returned, clutching a piece of paper saying, "We own our resources." There was just a strong sense born in the bred in the bone in a way in Alberta of suspicion and resentment of the metropolitan power down in Ottawa and Toronto. So that combined perhaps with some religious fervor in Alberta, because religious fervor often overlaps with these political movements. There was a strong religious bent in Alberta that was mostly Protestant, evangelical. And then, of course, you run into the same Great Depression and the poverty of the 30s. So some of the same forces were working in Alberta, but not to the same degree as Europe.
It's interesting, in my book, one of the most interesting things for me was in a lot of ways how Peggy and Balmer disagreed about Eberhard, that Balmer felt this was a man under no circumstances should be allowed to continue in office. My grandmother felt his social policies, which were trying to save the farmers who were all being foreclosed on by the banks, she had real sympathy because she had been a friend of the United Farm Women of Alberta, who kind of led into social credit in a certain sense. That let's call it a dialogue between Peggy and Balmer. Would that have been typical of the time, do you think?
Yes, I think so, because again, Eberhard, did represent a swath of social movements and change. The whole thing about funny money, which, social credit, what does that stand for? What does that mean, social credit? It means spending government funds in times of economic recession to help people maintain their purchasing power. Well, we just saw that happen during COVID at a large scale, but then he was just the head of Keynes at the time. That he was a Keynesian before Keynes, so it wasn't funny money. It was actually Douglas's whole idea that you could use money during periods of economic difficulty to maintain people's purchasing power. So $25 a month to farmers at that time would have been a very sensible thing to do. He knew the needs of people who didn't have there was no social safety net to speak of. He knew their needs, and he tried to get out ahead of where the whole world went only a few years later in terms of economic policy and perhaps even overt concern for people in need in times of stress.
Do you think that's reflected in those reporters who came up from New York and Washington and sat in the gallery of the legislature? Their interest in social credit. It seems like social credit's victory in 35 was nearly international news.
It was, and because it had this radical, if you will, economic idea, which became conventional wisdom, as I say, within a decade at the most. and now is totally, deeply converted into conventional wisdom and major policies. So again, Alberta, Alberta's never been afraid of experiments. Alberta is not hidebound. It's not tradition bound. It's open-minded for the most part in policy development. It's suspicious of catechisms. And so when social credit came in a world like in the United States too, where they were just starting to face up to Roosevelt's desire for social innovation, Alberta stood out among jurisdictions in North America. There were no states doing such things in the United States, certainly no provinces. So Alberta has been willing to flirt with different ideas, still does, that sometimes seem crazy, and sometimes they are, but sometimes they are not. Sometimes they're just seeing the world a little less encumbered by assumptions, I think.
Would that be tied to Alberta as a frontier? The fact that when Peggy and Balmer came out in 1905, it really was still the last best west of the railway posters and things.
Yes, I think that that whole frontier thesis in American historiography certainly applies to Alberta, and still does, in part because Alberta's population is still changing dramatically, and it comes in bursts and fits, but recently again it's changed dramatically. And so when you see, and the frontier in Alberta is so visible, it's not just 35 below for a whole month in 1969 in Edmonton when we went to university. It's that landscape. If you want to believe you're living in a frontier, it's a little hard to do it when you're in the middle of a nice green rolling farmland of southern Ontario. When you're driving around Alberta, just going a short distances, suddenly there are the Rockies on one side and this great prairie unfolding on the other. The word frontier, it just sort of comes into your mind or into your sensibility just by being in the landscape there.
And I guess the thing you'd add to that frontier is the tremendous amount of immigration in 1905. I mean, the policy of filling up that that western frontier, I guess, especially with the Americans still making certain veiled threats of expansion north. I mean, under Teddy Roosevelt, especially, I think.
Yes, Sifton, who was in charge of our immigration at that time, plastered Europe with great big posters. That's one of the reasons my grandparents came from Scandinavia, showing the mountains and a train going through the mountains, or great swaths of prairie promising free land, and by the way, free religion, free practice of any religion and language. That was made clear to come to the Canadian West, from Manitoba West. And so I think that since the turn of the century, 95, right up to 1914 was the height of that, just before the war. There was a very conscious sense of settling the frontier, if you will, with a great diversity of people who we lured there with promises, not only of land mostly, but also of their own cultural freedoms. That's where multiculturalism was born. It was born explicitly as a matter of federal policy in the West. And then it became a historic fact very quickly, within about 15 years, and of course rooted and still blooms there.
The Sifton going through Europe, and especially going through Eastern Europe, I mean, especially by 1917, you have quite a number of radical movements in Europe. Do you think that radicalism kind of came west with a lot of the immigration?
I don't think it so much, because most of the immigration, the major immigration in that context, was before up to 1914, and the great social movements, the communist movements, the fascist movements were born basically at the end of the war, and we didn't have the same rates of immigration. Now, there might have been influences through culture and through family and through connections and such. But I think that it was mostly cultural diversity rather than political diversity, although there was some of that that came with multiculturalism.
When you compare, what you've just described of Alberta, comparing it to the Ontario they left in 1905, I mean, they had had a fairly prosperous paper in Brantford, and they took a fairly enormous gamble coming west. How would you contrast the Ontario of that time that they left with what the frontier could provide?
Ontario at that time was very homogeneous, very almost more Scottish than English, almost very Presbyterian. There was very little diversity in Ontario's population at that time. And Ontario had a well-regulated system of land management and parceling out land and building roads and railroads, and it had churches and it had traditions, and not much challenged Ontario after it got settled by 1905. And then Peggy and Balmer go out to Alberta, which has very, very little infrastructure. It's open for claiming social values, language, religions. It has yet to be built, basically. I mean, they started off in a little wooden house down by the Saskatchewan River there, North Saskatchewan River. The legislature hadn't been built yet. The railway stopped sort of on the south side, and so it was an open book in ways that by then Ontario was assuming itself pretty sweetly to be a coherent outpost of the British Empire, which it was. Alberta was never an outpost of the British Empire. It had empire feelings and people from Britain. It never had that psychology. It was always much more up for grabs, if you will, in terms of where it was going to be and what's going to become. And it still feels like that in Alberta compared with Ontario.
As a newspaper editor, would that be what you just described? Would that be a major influence? Was this a very different constituency to publish a paper for?
Oh, yes. And I think that the fact that both Balmer and Peggy were journalists, and she had her interests and he had his, and how their careers developed through different ownerships of papers and such, and different weeklies and dailies and so forth. They were responding to the marketplace, of course. Newspapers are private enterprises. They have to get through the week, pay their staff. You have to find your readers. You have to know who they are. You have to speak to their interests and to their fears and to their hopes and to their community meetings and to their cultural events and such. So I would think that as obviously very successful journalists over many decades in Alberta, Peggy and Balmer would have been as close to the diversity and changing, roiling sometimes historical development of those people as anyone in the province.
How have we got one more question time? Yeah. Chester Ronning pops into my mind in terms of that by-election that he ran against. Was it Westvik in New Norway? A character like Ronning, does he come out of that frontier?
I don't know, because of course he was born in China and raised largely in China. So his influence as a young person before he came back to Alberta and Camrose would have been different, I think. I don't know enough about him in the 30s when he defeated my grandfather, Sivert Westvik, in that famous debate where they were on a stage in Camrose or New Norway, and Ronnie got up, pointed at my grandfather and his liberal supporters and said, there's a rumor going around here that I was raised on the milk of a Chinese woman as breastfeeding. And he said, it's true, I was. And he said, but it's also true that my opponent was raised on the milk of a cow. That may have won Ronning that by-election in the 30s for the United Farmers.
Yeah, no, well, it's interesting. I think that cabinet he sat in with Irene Paulby, I mean, given how conservative rural Alberta is now, rural Alberta was quite radical in those days.
Yes, it was. It was. And again, it was an agricultural province, and the farmers had a lot of political power, and they had a lot of interests that were being affected. I mean, by the weather, by the banks, by changing technology, changing marketplaces, and they were well organized. In part, as Peggy would find out in her coverage, through their wives, and their wives had social clubs, and their wives were politically active, perhaps even more politically plugged in than their husbands, and they weren't shrinking away. This was the prairies, after all. It takes everybody to make things work. And so Chester Ronning certainly would have been part of that milieu in the Camrose, New Norway area.
Yeah, it's interesting. Peggy herself, as a reporter, I think ties into that that fact, the growing power of women, especially at a time when they couldn't even vote.
Yeah, she would go out, as you reported in your book, she would go out to small towns on winter days to cover local community meetings, often women's clubs and church basements and town halls, and report on all these things. She took those things seriously because they had to be taken seriously. These people had power. These weren't just kind of chat clubs. They had power to determine who's going to be the government of Alberta. And so the farmers, and meaning the men and women of a farm, needed to be politically conscious and aware of their interests and organized to protect them, which they did through United Farmers, of course.
Okay, I'm gonna stop us.
Okay.
We're gonna sign out for a second, William, and then sign back on. So just
Sure.
give us a minute. We're gonna stop tape and check everything. And then we'll be right back. I'll sign on with you in literally 3 minutes. All right?
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, the term investigative reporting has a certain connotation. It generally means go out and uncover egregious wrongdoing and expose it and set the world right again. And I think that's useful, but often is overestimated as a role for newspapers. It's a good one, but it's not the only one. What she was doing was what you might call enterprise reporting, where you say things are going on and a lot of people aren't paying attention to what's going on there, but I can see that this is important, and I'm going to make an effort to go out where we don't usually go to cover groups, issues, topics that are not usually in the newspaper. And some of the best newspapers, the history of best newspapers, are where they identify new topics, new movements, and get out there early and fast and get on the ground and see what's happening here on the ground. When I became the editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail, I had views on this, and within a very short time, I created, for example, new beats, one on multiculturalism. We didn't cover multiculturalism in a very multicultural city. One called social trends, because there were many trends, technological and social and sexual, that were unveiling all around us. And one called workplace, rather than labor beat, which covered labor unions. Things are going on in the workplaces that are really interesting, that we're not covering because we just want to cover the politics of labor. And Peggy would be an example of enterprise reporting, where she's got her wits about her. She's got her ears open and her eyes open. She gets around and she sees that women's groups or other groups, community groups in towns, are organizing. They're having meetings. What are they saying in those meetings? Why are they doing this? Where are they going? What's happening? Those are the very best instincts that a reporter can have, or an editor can have, to stay on top of what's really happening in the world.
Yeah, and I think it sets up a kind of interesting dialectic between she and Balmer. I mean, Balmer, who really had to keep a paper alive through advertisers and investors, that the dialogues between them must have been fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, he played the role to a degree that a publisher plays, which is to keep the business whole and keep it going and make the money and pay the bills, as well as being an editor. And he probably had other interests. You know, every individual is different, and his interest might have been at the more covering the political angles or the economics, the larger picture of economics and stuff. Peggy had her feet on the ground and her bum in a carriage going out to cover meetings. And so, you know, you need, for a great paper, you need people with different orientations, different sensibilities, different passions. And certainly the editor, or the editor publisher in his case, I think, you know, is not going to be going out to little community meetings. But he certainly needs people who do. And it happened to be his wife in this case who led the charge in Alberta.
Tell me a little bit about Mr. Bramley Moore.
Bramley Moore. Bramley Moore wrote a book in 1912, something about colony of Canada or something, Alberta. He was
Canada and her colony.
Canada and her colonies, and Alberta was obviously the colony. So this is 1912. This is just 7 years after the birth of the province, and he's in the legislature as a Liberal member, I believe, and writes a book that is just furious with the unjust treatment of Alberta by the imperial power called mostly Toronto and then Ottawa. It's a very eloquent book. I found it in the Edmonton Journal Library one day, searching around, never seen it before, read it, and started running excerpts in the Edmonton Journal op-ed page just to fuel the fires of the 1970s were being filled by Bramley Moore, who unfortunately went to the front and was killed in the war. But his roots, what he said there, just tell you about the authenticity of the roots of this attitude, bred in the bone in Alberta. If that's 1912, and Bramley Moore's book is that well documented, that passionately argument, that angry in 1912, there's something more going on than just this or that issue in Alberta. It's an attitude. It's an independent streak. It's an element of anger even that's part of the scene, and I think it's fundamentally kind of creative for the country. I mean, many of the other parts of Canada are rather complacent and self-satisfied in dealing with their own navels, but Alberta had that from the beginning. In Bramley Moore's book, what a guy he must have been. I wish he had survived the war and gone back into politics in the 20s.
Okay. Let's start to shift more towards the present day. The kind of centralization of the media, if you want to call it that, especially newspapers, that is with us now. I mean, last year, 26 local papers, very similar to Peggy and Balmer's Saturday newspaper, were shut down in Alberta by Post Media, having bought them up in the years before they shut them all down. What does that mean for democracy, let's say?
You know, it's a very complex evolution that we don't fully understand yet, because the decline of 26 community newspapers in Alberta is going on at the same time that 2 million people in Alberta are writing blogs on the internet and creating Substacks and creating their own little newspapers. In a sense, there has been a great challenge on the advertising side to newspapers for their revenues, of course. But on the other sense, they're now the many speak to the many. It used to be said you don't argue with a man who buys printing ink by the carload. That was newspapers. They had a monopoly. Now with social media, the many speak to many. And so the newspapers themselves are competing against individuals sometimes, or small groups that have created important news covering sites such as Politico and Unheard and a whole series of much smaller newsrooms, if you will, that are subscriber based and that do a very good job. So it's difficult at this early stage of this evolution to understand the meanings for democracy, although, of course, one of them is that idiots and bad people also get the megaphone, and that's one thing that matters. But in the general sense, there has been a democratization of access to large audiences through media. So the loss of particular newspapers doesn't have the import that it once had, I think.
And yet it seems that stay with Alberta, that it's leading towards kind of a polarization politically, with the social media, this kind of exchange of ideas among groups that we would have, let's say Balmer would have tried to accomplish in his day, seems to be more difficult.
I think it's more difficult, yes, and it's in part because groups with views and interests that are further away from the center, if you will, are able to find each other much more easily. They used to be rather atomized in any society, any province, even a city. Now they can find each other. They can then organize online and amplify their voices, and then build their communities in ways that were impossible before. So that part of the social network is really sort of a grassroots, ground up evolution of political factions that was always there, but this facilitates it very, very much. And so we see this emerging across the board. It emerges not only in terms of right-wing politics, even left-wing groups can do this, and now culturally dominating groups can do this. Gangs, violent, criminal people can do this. So it's a much more volatile situation, and it means that if you're in politics today, national, provincial, even local politics, you really have to be able to articulate the general or the common interest much more clearly than you did before, because you're facing a lot more challenges to what that means.
Excuse me. This whole issue of disinformation, is that more a problem now than it has been in the past?
Disinformation now is, before the internet and social media, disinformation, the biggest source of disinformation was often governments themselves. And you had to be careful. That's why press was so important, looking out for what they were doing, what they were hiding, what they were saying. Different disinformation is now sometimes it's a weapon of governments, as we can see from Russia and China, and the United States uses it as well all over the place. It is sometimes actually people honestly believe the bad information. They don't think they're doing disinformation. So, the view on many of these platforms that we abhor so much, or that we doubt and regret so much, are sincerely held. And so is it disinformation, or is there some other word to describe the kind of passion and conviction that these people have? It means it's much more competitive. It's much more dangerous for politicians to get caught by misstating things and suddenly being typed as a certain kind of person. So it's a much more volatile situation.
Yeah, it's interesting to think of Eberhard in this context. I mean, the biographies on him kind of make it clear that, I mean, he believed on one very apocalyptic context that the world might disappear in 1,000 days, so that what seems ridiculous to us was information for him. It's sort of religion and disinformation come together in him in a way.
Yes, I mean, I think reference to religion is a good one to make because many different religions and sects within religions are passionately convinced that the world will end in 1,000 days or next year or a couple of years, the great coming, or by the end of times and so forth. And it doesn't mean that they don't think that they're wrong. They don't think that they're misled. They don't think they're naive. They believe this passionately. So religion has always been a matter of faith. And so now we have a lot of other groups that are not religious that also believe fulsomely that they need to be armed with their guns and go to the country and prepare for the end of times. It just means that the challenge for media, for the so-called mainstream media, or for political leaders to articulate and communicate, the powers to communicate are now so essential because you're communicating in a context of many challenges and many stupid and crazy ideas that are coming from everywhere and have audiences. So the translates into a leadership challenge that has evolved for people in politics and media and other groups in the community that keep an eye on the broader world and center and try to be more, as we would say, fact-based in their views to communicate and to continue to communicate.
The you see the term out there now of there being, and especially in the United States, more and more news deserts on the landscape. Places where there had been regional papers or local papers that just had not been able to survive. What do you think? What do you think of that? What are the dangers of that?
I think that news deserts definitely now exist, particularly in the smaller cities and towns, where the social media are never going to do the humdrum work of covering the city council and the school board and the water supply company and so forth. That just doesn't get covered, and it deprives people of the knowledge and tools to assess what they should be doing when it comes to political choices and social movements. And so the social media will never be able to fill the gap of smaller papers that covered the sort of quotidian issues that really matter to people in their communities. There is no solution to that yet, and there may never be one. We may just have to live with the consequences of voters and citizens who are just not going to be as able to assess their own situations as they were in the past.
And do you think the social media can kind of fill that gap? I mean, you know, that it seems to be heading in that direction.
I don't think it can, because social media tends to be focused on particular issues of passionate interest people producing the media. The papers would go out and do, as I say, these daily tasks of just telling you about the train accidents, the car accidents, and the fires, and the decisions at the school board and the city council. Social media, for the most part, doesn't care about these things. It cares about more passionate, sexy, emotional matters. And so I think we have not found a way to fill that gap yet.
And the is it fair to say that the changes are leading us to a more kind of centralized political culture?
No, I don't think so. I mean, in fact, it's becoming disaggregated, and there are so many now significant different sources of conviction and organization in society that for what used to be a big tent party or something, to try to keep them together within a tent, to centralize, if you will, to bridge those things, is getting harder and harder, as we've seen with the Conservative Party of Canada. We're probably going to see with the Liberals here. Certainly in the United States, the Republican Party has fractured down 3 or 4 levels. The Democratic Party is at war with itself right now on 3 or 4 major global and domestic issues with factions. The Congress of the United States is getting more and more reflective of the disaggregation of views, powers, and interests in the United States by being unable to come to consensus to pass basic laws. So it's really a matter of disaggregation rather than more aggregation.
The kind of well, how to describe it? You know, Daniel Smith and bringing the bogeyman of Ottawa back into Alberta politics, you know, nearly on a daily basis, and sometimes in the most unexpected places. What accounts for that?
Well, maybe it's a signal of, you know, the problem of disaggregation. You know, she's sort of becoming the, you know, the chief whip on the horse trying to herd the cattle, are getting harder to herd. So what do? You find a wolf to help you herd the cattle. They'll all run in the same direction. And so Alberta, and other places too, knows that if you can find a wolf to scare the piglets, you can herd people together by creating false threats. This is a classic political tendency. And perhaps in a world of greater social media disaggregation, disintegration in some ways of social consensus, these tools in politics, which can be very dangerous, we see them with Trump too, find 2 or 3 threats that will overcome these varieties of views, mostly if it's immigration, if it's Ottawa, if it's the climate, in some cases change. Find some things that will impose a threat of danger on people, because fear is the one thing that may unite people across their different views. And fear mongering is a famously successful tendency. So maybe we have to be aware that as society becomes less unified on many of the basic issues, smart politicians will start using fear, as we've certainly seen in Europe and the United States, and now in Alberta, as a mean, fear and resentment as a mean of bridging these gaps.
Yeah, well, that sort of leads us to Trump, doesn't it? And, well, how would you describe his significance to what's happening to the world?
He's a very good example of what we're just saying. You know, the United States is becoming disaggregated anyway at the social level and regionally, and by interests and economics and disparities of wealth and immigration forces and so on. And so Trump emerged to give voice to one large group by immediately on his first statement coming down that escalator, saying that the United States was being invaded by rapists and torturers and criminals from Mexico, and that's why they should vote for Trump. So Trump is not a cause of any of this. He's a very skillful manipulator, a very user of the disaggregation we're seeing in society by being a man who knows how to use fear and how to use invective and how to create tribes out of people who are not normally in the same group. This is a very good example. You can see this starting to evolve in political parties in Europe and in other parts of the world right now. The so-called strongman theory of government is spreading widely across the world because people are seeing a world going astray and being threatened in so many ways, and they're better customers for this kind of appeal.
The spat, I guess, last year between Ottawa and Google and these big internet services about carrying news. What does that tell us?
Oh, that tells us a lot about Ottawa, because because the policy of requiring Meta and Google and these big platforms to start paying for linkages to Canadian media is, I think, just wrong-headed. The Canadian media, some of them would say they should be paying Meta for getting all the linkages. All these people are doing on their various sources of platform are suddenly will pop a note saying, oh, there's a story in the Globe and Mail about this. And if you want to read it, you have to click onto the Globe and Mail link and see whether you can read the story. The newspapers in particular and this is well argued in the Globe and Mail these days in their columns, have benefited enormously by these links. They're not stealing content, they're linking to content that's in a paper. The paper then writes that down and says to its advertisers, oh, we had another 500,000 readers on this story from all over the world or all over Canada yesterday because they picked it up off of Google or off of Meta. So the government, it's an effort by the government to come to the aid of newspapers financially by going through these platforms, but it's not a logical way of doing it. And they're just trying to do it at somebody else's expense. They're already giving some money to the newspapers, the industry, as they have announced, but they're trying to give more money by going through this route. Many papers are now realizing, since they were cut off by Meta, I believe it was at the beginning, or Google, one of the two, suddenly the traffic on their sites has plummeted because they're not getting links anymore. And they're the ones who made the links, who posted the links. And so they're rethinking that policy. It's just a sign, again, of the conundrum that we face when major media income declines to the degree where so many papers close. Now, that having been said, there are some papers who have figured this out, that they live in a new world where advertising, which used to be 75% of the income, is now going to be 22% of the income. Where's the rest going to come from? As the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Globe and Mail, the Financial Times show, you have to start charging readers, and they're only going to pay for the stuff if it's worthwhile their time. You're buying their time. You're not selling a newspaper, we used to say. So some papers are getting across that bridge and becoming very profitable again, based on new business models that rely on reader subscriptions and reader payment. That's true also of many of the smaller news sites that are very good news sites that are subscriber based, that are able to employ really good people, and they don't have much overhead costs, of course, no printing, and they're able to do it. So the federal government, I was at a dinner party recently in Toronto with some very smart people who are nationally known in politics and academia. We talked about Ottawa. I asked one of the academics, what does Ottawa do well? And she said, nothing. And she's in the area of foreign policy, but the rest of us mostly in area economics and provincial relationships. But Ottawa these days is not to be looked at for leadership in managing, much less policy development.
The to come back to the significance of the Pulitzer, could you just tell us a little bit about what that prize represents, or what it was meant to represent?
I think the Pulitzer retains its very high standing and its very high reputation, because the juries that determine rewards for reporting, for editorial writing, for columns, for enterprise reporting, and so forth, are very solid juries and have been able to stay away from, saying they just liked the story, that's why they'll give it the award. The story has had to show enterprise, it has to show intelligence, it has to show an element of context, and knows the context, and it has to show perseverance and skill set and knowledge base. And so when the Pulitzer is given out today, even in the United States, it's highly coveted because it reflects the very best and deep traditions of journalism. The one that went outside of the United States to the Edmonton Journal for its resistance to Aberhart's basically fascistic efforts to control newspapers and news and opinion in Alberta, just shows how important that particular move by the Edmonton Journal was. The Pulitzer doesn't look outside of the United States. That's not its mandate. It made a special case here. And it speaks again to the fundamental importance of the mainstream media, if you will, and some of the smaller on-sites media to hold to account efforts by governments and corporations and even some other nonprofit groups to hold them accountable for their role in society, both in terms of the information that they can get on them, and also to ensure that people's views are not squashed just for what they say.
This term fake news is that just people being sort of hysterical? Is it really not grounded in fact?
Well, there's lots of fake news. It doesn't generally come, though, from the New York Times. And, you know, Mr. Trump, when he says fake news, means the New York Times, or he means CNN, or he means the most credible engines of news in the United States. He calls them fake because they're the least fake. There's lots of fake news from some magazines, and lots of it online and on various sites. So there's no question that it's there. He's just weaponized it against for the very reason that these news outlets are objective, and so he's trying to rope them in. It's a sign of his desperation and also of his skill, because it's caught on. So now the recent polls in the United States show that public respect for the titans of American traditional journalism, New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, some of the main television networks and such, has really plummeted in the last 3 years alone. And that's because of this constant repetition by people like Trump that these are just another voice on the internet, which they are not, of course.
The back to disinformation and information. I was reading on a site the other day, somebody saying that in news reporting, data and a reliance on data is so important as opposed to relying on anecdote. You know, and could you talk a little bit about that? How responsible newspapers make sure that they get the data in front of the reader?
You know, that data as a foundation of particularly complex stories is absolutely critical to the credibility of good reporting and analysis in newspapers. And you have to have leadership that believes that in your editors, but you then have to hire the right people. And so in my case, responsible for Report on Business, which is Canada's leading daily business newspaper, it was very important that we hired people as reporters who had great educations in economics and statistical analysis and all of the tools they needed to understand business and finance. Without the reporters, you can't provide a credible story. And so it comes down to the qualifications of the people who get hired by editors who know themselves what they're hearing and what they're not hearing. There's no point in sending a reporter to an annual meeting of a bank and have the chairman and the people read out all their stuff and lay out all their data if the reporter can't understand what he's hearing and doesn't know what questions to ask or how he's being snowed. And so data is really critical. I'll give you an example from this very week in relation to the war in Ukraine. The Wall Street Journal just published an extensive set of charts that said, here's the war in charts. These are pure data charts. The number of shells being fired last year by each side compared with this side, the number of people in each army, the number of square kilometers won or lost. There's just a whole series of charts. People have many views, and of course, both sides in that war are saying we're doing fine and we're making progress and we'll win. The charts tell a story that is undeniable. Now, you might want to argue with what they mean, but you can't argue with the charts. And this is really important, particularly in highly polarized situations of politics, where only the data show. In Alberta's case, the premier wants to maybe leave the Canadian pension plan, the national plan, and her advisor says, "Oh, you can take half the national plan's assets to set up your own." That's data. Well, it isn't true. And when the data come out on how much Alberta could take out of the plan and then how much it would cost the average Albertan when they turn 65, that referendum will not go through because the data will win.
Just to finish, we've got 2 minutes.
It'll kill. If it dies, William will click back on in a second, okay?
But I think Peggy's, reporting, as you go into the 1930s, very sort of directed against the Bank of Montreal, the Bay Street banks in general, and the fact that they were able to put an end to the hopes of so many of those farmers. And do you think that was important in terms of representing Albertans?
It was important because in those days, the banks were blind to regional differences to a large degree. They didn't have regional intelligence. They didn't have regional staff. They were very centralized. They didn't have the same sense of their own self-interest in trying to keep people afloat through difficult times, so they would still be there at the end of the day. And so, particularly when it came to farmers, I think that the farmers had every reason to really be appalled and depressed at the attitude of banks from central Canada that just wouldn't get it and would just look at the numbers and cut them off. That doesn't happen today because the banks are smarter and the pressures on them are much greater and they're much more decentralized. But it certainly was true in Peggy's time.
Super. Okay.
Okay, what we're gonna do is we're gonna stop and let's just have a quick chat. So give us 1 second. I'm gonna kill this and then just click back on. We'll just have a final quick chat, William.
Okay.
So end this.